Hello everyone, my name is Gábor Schering and I'm a Marie Curie Fellow at Bocconi University. And the title of my presentation is Deindustrialization and Social Death, Challenges for Medical Sociology. As probably most of you are aware, there's a growing interest in the health implications of deindustrialization. There's this bestseller book published by Nobel laureate Angus Deaton and N.K.'s about the deaths of despair epidemic in the US that has been unfolding over the last 20 years, showing quite shocking growth in death rates among working class people in the North American Rust Belt. Similar processes have been identified also in the United Kingdom in some areas. And there's less talk about it, but a quite similar death of despair epidemic, a mortality crisis, has hit Eastern European countries in the 90s as well. And the graph is from my research, from the quantitative side of the research projects, which shows the correlation between the collapse of industrial employment and male mortality in Hungary. As you can see, as long as industrial employment is collapsing, mortality is increasing, but mortality stops increasing when industrial employment stops collapsing. Now in Hungary, industrial employment declined by more than 50% between 1987 and 1995. So we are talking about a huge deindustrialization shock that hit this country, and in fact many other countries in Eastern Europe. So I'm contributing to the sociology of these deaths of despair through a field work that I conducted in Hungary. I selected 4 medium-sized industrialized towns, 2 of them moderately and 2 of them severely deindustrialized, and I conducted, with the help of research assistants, 82 semi-structured interviews with adults who were of working age already in 1989, so I have a good way to compare quality of life and the lived experience of economic processes before and after regime change. And the whole interview corpus is quite long, and I analyzed it with qualitative thematic analysis using NVO. As you can see, it's a big body of text, more than 2,000 pages. So instead of getting into the details of the empirical results, I won't show you quotes, but I will show you a very general overview of health discourses, and then I concentrate more on the insights, the theoretical takeaways from Hungary's case for other cases. So the theoretical debate is between what I call the supply culture approach and the economic dislocation proposition. So the supply culture approach looks at the industry, looks at ill health and the deaths of despair through the lens of drug supply. In the case of Eastern Europe, it was alcohol supply and dysfunctional working class culture that determine adverse health behavior and essentially lead to increased death rates. Now, I propose a fundamentally sociological alternative to this reading that is quite popular among economics and behavior epidemiologists. And I think that sociology has really great roots in analyzing social deaths. And I particularly rely on Lincoln Fallon's fundamental cause theory, which suggests to look behind downstream mechanisms such as lifestyle and look at the fundamental causes. They talk about class, race, and job status. And there's, we know all of this, there's a big research on how these factors influence individual lifestyles. And central to the fundamental cause argument is that these factors reproduce health inequality even as knowledge and adverse health behavior accumulates and incomes grow. And I propose to analyze the industrialization as a fundamental cause of ill health that affects health through multiple mechanisms, so individual and contextual, and the negative consequences of deindustrialization might also persist in the long run, continuing to affect health even decades after plant closings. So, as I said, I conducted these interviews in 4 deindustrialized towns in Hungary, and this is just to give you a way to just give you a summary of the results, how interviewees talk about health. So this is analyzing the parts of the interviews which are directly connected to health, and after eliminating other filler words or non-essential words, this is just a word frequency visualized as a word cloud. And as you can see, of course, illness is a central concept, but what this word cloud reveals is that there's quite a few words referring to mental health and potentially to stress, but also there's words that are referring to community, to neighborhoods, but also to work, such as the word work itself, or job, or processes that affected the companies, especially related to the closure of these companies. So this word cloud already gives you an overview how interviewees talk about health, and interviewees themselves do not separate health from the broader social and economic context, and I don't think that analysts should do it. And analyzing these interviews, building from the interviews themselves up, abstracting key underlying themes and concepts, I identified 6 mechanisms through which deindustrialization leads to ill health and deaths of despair. And I call this the 6 mechanism model of deindustrialization as a fundamental cause. So the first mechanism is material deprivation, job, income loss, indebtedness. This is perhaps the most obvious effect of deindustrialization, as people lose their jobs. But even those who do not lose their jobs might experience increased work-related pressures, higher workload, or precarious employment situations. Crucially, deindustrialization also affects social identities such as work, place, or even gender identities that are tied up with work, and especially with industrial work in the case of men particularly. Deindustrialization also affects social inequalities, such as income inequalities, racial or ethnic inequalities, and inequalities in power, in people's capacity to influence social and political processes in the industrialization itself. Fifth, it negatively impacts community services. That these are very important resources that people can rely on to cope, such as health, culture, care, or sports services. And finally, it impacts communities, social capital broadly, but also narrower communities such as families. The industrialization might destabilize families themselves. And as you can see, I identified individual pathways and social pathways. So the first 3 are individual pathways that lead to an increase in psychosocial stress. In the case of loss of social identities, I also believe that it decreases people's capacity to cope with stress. Now, social pathways also represent directly sources of stress, and they also erode communal resources to cope with stress. And the repeated experience of being unable to cope with stress generated by the industrialization is what leads in the longer run to desperation. So it's a kind of feeling of helplessness, powerlessness, inability to being able to cope with change, stress. And this leads to either directly to ill health or to adverse health behavior as a dysfunctional coping strategies such as drug use or hazardous drinking. And through this, the industrialization leads to deaths of despair. So these are the 6 mechanisms that I identified through the interviews. And I also tried to identify backing of this in the literature as well, in the paper. So as Case and Deaton say, these mechanisms, I believe, offer important insights from the East to the West. As Case and Deaton say, it is no exaggeration to compare the long-standing misery of these Eastern Europeans with the wave of despair that is driving suicides, alcohol, and drug abuse among less educated white Americans. So the lesson for the US is, for example, to paraphrase, to summarize the lessons quickly, it's that the Steckler family is only one of the villains in the story. You know, Steckler family is the owners of Purdue Pharma, played a crucial role in the spread of the use of OxyContin, a powerful opioid painkiller. But the results from Hungary show that the US is not exceptional. Profuse drug supply is only part of the causes. And this mechanism from deindustrialization to economic dislocation and the 6 individual and contextual level mechanisms leading to stress and despair, and then to that, I believe also applies to the US, but also to other cases such as deindustrialization in the UK. Now, of course, there are some important differences as well, similarities, but I also like to emphasize that these differences do not mean that these are unique, exceptional cases. Indeed, even where we see differences, there are commonalities even. So the similarities are in the way deindustrialization affects material deprivation, work-related pressures, in the way it destabilizes social identities, creates political inequalities, weakening of trade unions, destabilization of communities, decay of working class culture, and the way it increases income inequality. Now, there are a few important differences. First, the macro context was, of course, somewhat different. The East started transitioning from state socialism to neoliberal capitalism, whereas the West started from organized Fordist capitalism, but the end point was more or less similar neoliberal capitalism. The industrialization in the East unfolded in one wave, leading to, for example, in the case of Hungary, 50% of loss in less than 10 years, whereas in the West, it unfolded more slowly over 30 years. The kinds of debts are, in both cases, related to stress and despair, but slightly different. In the East, it's about alcohol, suicides, infarctions, and mental health, whereas in the West, in the US especially, we're talking about drugs, alcohol, and an increase in suicides. There's also a difference in the way it impacted gender identities, because in the case of East, we were starting from a relatively gender progressive set of institutions that, and then their collapse led to a re-traditionalization of gender roles. Because of the loss of care services that were provided by the state under socialism. In the West, we are more observing more kind of a postmodernization of gender roles and an emergence of weak market-based care services. There's some differences in the way it impacts racial inequality. Whereas in the East, we are seeing higher ethnic homogeneity and badly affected Roma communities in rural areas and outskirts. In the West, it was in the first wave that Blacks suffered more. In the second wave, it's more divides in the non-metro areas that seem to suffer more. And there are some slight differences in the way it impacts services in the East and the West. So to conclude, this research has mapped the industrialization and the way it leads to health, offering insights from the East to the West. The health effect of the industrialization is complex and layered mechanism involving both individual and supra-individual processes. And these processes crucially reproduce ill health even as income grows long after plant closures. So we are not just talking about the direct short-term implications such as losing a job or income, but all the other mechanisms identified. And finally, Therefore, we need complex research approaches and policy responses to tackle the underlying fundamental causes of stress and despair through social and economic policy. Thank you very much.